Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are moving past, the incredible architecture of creation that we saw in the first two chapters of Genesis.
We really are.
We're stepping into what is, arguably the single most important pivot point in the entire source material.
Absolutely. This is where we see the introduction of moral complexity, of consequence, and, of conflict into the human story.
It's the moment that really defines the human condition from this point on, isn't it?
It is. Genesis chapters 1 and 2, they set up this world that was, for lack of a better word, perfect. The text itself says it was very good.
Right. And it ends with the man and woman being naked and were not ashamed. A state of pure innocence.
Exactly. And they had immense freedom. They were given dominion over creation. They were living in a literal paradise, the Garden of Eden, with access to all its bounty.
And all of that pristine, unburdened existence really just hinged on one single restriction.
Just one.
One tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the command was so simple, so absolute. It was delivered to the man, and it said, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." So chapter 3 isn't just a small deviation. It's the instantaneous shattering of that covenant of innocence.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to do a deep, almost forensic analysis of this chapter using the American Standard Version. We're going to chart that very rapid, catastrophic descent.
And we're going to track that chain reaction, right? From the subtle doubt through the temptation and the transgression itself.
All the way to the immediate psychological consequence, which is shame, and then the lasting physical and relational consequences, toil, pain, and mortality. We're really unpacking the original archetypal dramatic pivot.
So the narrative begins, and this is what's so fascinating, not with some big clash of titans or an invasion from outside.
It's a simple, quiet conversation right in the heart of paradise. And the introduction of this antagonist is so telling. It starts in Genesis 3, verse 1. "Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which Jehovah God had made."
That word subtle, it just encapsulates the entire nature of the challenge here. In the Hebrew, the word is aram.
Aram.
Yeah, and it can mean shrewd, crafty, or even wise, but it almost always has this manipulative sense to it.
Okay.
It suggests an intelligence, an ingenuity that's not being used for creation or harmony, but for deception.
And it's crucial that the text right there, it explicitly identifies this being as a beast of the field.
Absolutely critical.
Why is that so important as a narrative choice?
Well, it prevents you, the reader, at this early stage from seeing this as some, external cosmic force that just bypassed Eden's security.
Right, like an alien invasion or something.
Exactly. The danger is portrayed as inherent. It's something within the environment that they were supposed to rule over.
So the first great challenge to humanity comes from a creature they were supposed to have dominion over. That just emphasizes how close and deceptive the threat really is.
And that word subtlety, in this context, it's the introduction of ambiguity into a world that was, up until now, defined by this black and white simplicity.
Yeah, the commands were so direct before.
Yeah.
Be fruitful, replenish the earth.
Don't eat this one fruit.
Right.
And the serpent just immediately introduces this nuance, this equivocation, and the possibility that, hey, maybe things aren't quite as they seem.
And its first move is just a masterful rhetorical strike. It doesn't deny God's command outright, not at first.
Yeah.
It questions God's generosity by framing the question to exaggerate the prohibition. It says, "Yea, hath God said, ye shall not eat of any tree of the garden."
And that's the genius of the deception right there. It strategically ignores the vast permission they were granted.
To eat from every other tree.
Every other tree, and it focuses only on amplifying the one single restriction. The serpent forces the woman to defend the abundant grace they were enjoying.
And by doing that, it shifts the whole focus from their incredible liberty to their one tiny limitation. It's sowing doubt with a loaded question.
It is. And this prompting, it causes the woman to articulate the prohibition herself, which is key because her reply reveals a slight, but as it turns out, fatal inaccuracy.
Okay. Let's get into that.
So in Genesis 3, verses 2 and 3, she correctly states the permission part. She says, "Of the fruit of the trees we may eat." That's correct.
But then
regarding the central restriction, she says God had said, "Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die."
Neither shall you touch it. That part. That wasn't in the original command given to Adam, was it?
It was not. The original decree in Genesis 2 was strictly about consumption, about eating.
So why is that little addition, that sort of hedge around the law, why is that so significant here?
Well, it implies a couple of things. Maybe the gravity of the consequence death caused a human elaboration on the law. Perhaps Adam was teaching Eve the rule and added a safeguard.
Like a parent saying, don't even go near the street.
Precisely. If you don't even touch it, you won't be tempted to eat it. But by extending the prohibition beyond the divine word, she gives the subtle serpent a physical opportunity to test the boundary without immediately triggering the consequence of eating.
Oh, wow.
It introduces a vulnerability, because if she touches it and doesn't die instantly, then the severity of the actual prohibition is immediately undermined. It just weakens the authority of the warning.
That makes the narrative progression just chillingly logical. Because once that little inaccuracy is on the table, the serpent moves from subtle questioning to a direct, open confrontation.
Right. In verses 4 and 5, the conversation just pivots. It goes from doubt about the scope of the command to a direct contradiction of the consequence. "You shall not surely die," the serpent says, just flat out denying the mortality promised by God.
That's the moment it becomes an opposing theological voice, right?
Yeah.
It's setting up a completely different understanding of reality.
And it backs up this denial with an alternative motivation for the prohibition. The serpent claims the command wasn't about protecting them.
No, it was about holding them back.
Exactly. It was about preventing them from achieving a higher divine status. It argues that God knows that eating will open your eyes, and ye shall be as God, knowing good and evil.
And this is the core of the temptation, the real appeal.
This is everything. The serpent reframes obedience as stagnation. You're being kept dependent, simple, ignorant, and disobedience. Well, that's presented as elevation, as achieving self-sufficiency and true enlightenment.
Specifically, the acquisition of the knowledge of good and evil. It's challenging the whole structure of innocent dependency for the sake of, moral autonomy.
That's the perfect way to put it.
So let's dive into that knowledge for a second. What does knowing good and evil actually imply in the context of this story? Is it like omniscience, or is it something more fundamental?
It's not necessarily omniscience, no. The context really suggests it's the acquisition of a moral perspective. It's the ability to discern, to experience, and to judge the difference between good and evil, but independently of divine instruction.
Okay, so before this, they only knew good.
They only knew the life God had established for them. They existed in a state of moral simplicity. The serpent is suggesting that true adulthood, or true divinity, lies in grasping the duality. It would allow them to define their own moral framework.
But the serpent's statement is deeply paradoxical, isn't it? I mean, if it says, ye shall not surely die, but then death, mortality, is immediately pronounced as a curse later in verse 19. Was the serpent just lying, or was it twisting the truth?
And that's what's so fascinating, because the serpent's claim about the mechanism, your eyes shall be opened, that part actually comes true in verse 7. They did gain knowledge.
So it wasn't a total lie.
It wasn't a total lie. The serpent wasn't lying about the knowledge acquisition. It was lying about the outcome and the consequence. They didn't achieve the good, benevolent status of God. They achieved a compromised, painful, fearful awareness, and they definitely began a process that led to physical decay and death.
So the lie was one of omission and misdirection.
Exactly. It leveraged a partial truth, you'll gain knowledge, to justify a catastrophic choice. The narrative suggests the real choice here was less about food and more about jurisdiction.
A choice between defined goodness under God's authority or
self-defined moral awareness, purchased at the cost of innocence.
Which brings us to the actual moment of transgression in Genesis 3, verse 6. This is such a pivotal verse. It tracks the collapse of their resistance in 3 distinct stages. The threefold appeal.
And this isn't just about tasting a piece of fruit. This is a narrative blueprint for how temptation works. It shows the whole transition from rational prohibition to prioritized desire.
Let's dedicate some time to these 3 factors, because they really do demonstrate a rationalization process that's rooted in human ambition. The first 2 are sensory and immediate. She saw that the tree was good for food.
Right, and that addresses the basic physiological need, the practicality of consumption, even though, they had access to every other tree in the garden.
It wasn't about hunger.
Not at all, but it validates the appetite. It makes the forbidden thing seem permissible, maybe even necessary in terms of sustaining life.
Okay, so that's the first one. The second is that it was a delight to the eyes. This shifts from necessity to aesthetic appeal, the visual lure.
The lust of the eye, it moves beyond just sustenance to pleasure. It makes the object attractive purely because of how it looks. It's a desire for possession, for enjoyment of something visually appealing.
But the real engine of the decision, the one that ties directly back to the serpent's argument, is the third element.
The heavy hitter.
Yeah, that the tree was to be desired to make one wise.
And there it is. This is the intellectual ambition, the craving for the promised knowledge, the desire for self-elevation and autonomy. The first two factors, they validate the act of consumption, but this third one provides the moral justification for the transgression.
It's a perceived pursuit of something inherently valuable, wisdom.
So the narrative makes it clear this wasn't some sudden, unthinking impulse. It was a perceived logical conclusion based on a corrupted weighing of the factors. She saw the benefits, she desired the promised wisdom, and then she acted.
She took of the fruit thereof and did eat. And the action immediately includes the man.
Immediately, and she gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. The text implies Adam was either physically present or, at the very least, immediately available and complicit.
And unlike the detailed psychological breakdown we get for the woman, for Adam he just eats.
The silence speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Right.
He accepts the fruit, and by extension the consequence, without any protest or stated deliberation. It really suggests a failure to uphold the responsibility that was given directly to him.
So the immediate consequence is described with this crushing irony in Genesis 3, verse 7. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked.
The serpent's promise came true. Their eyes were opened, but that promised elevation to divinity was instantly replaced by this terrifying recognition of their own vulnerability and deficiency.
It's a profound shift. Innocence is replaced by shame. The text from chapter 2, that they were naked and unashamed, that's just functionally revoked.
And they didn't gain external knowledge about the cosmos. The first piece of knowledge they acquired was a painful inward knowledge about their own altered status. Nakedness becomes synonymous with fear and exposure.
And their immediate instinctual response to this shame isn't to seek divine help. It's self-reliance. It's concealment.
They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons.
This detail, it marks the very first instance of human labor that's driven by necessity and shame.
They're trying to cover a massive spiritual and moral wound with a flimsy physical self-made solution.
It just highlights the profound inadequacy of human effort to mend the breach they just created.
They gained autonomy, and their very first act of autonomy was a desperate, insufficient attempt at camouflage.
That sense of separation and shame, it just climaxes in the next verse, verse 8. They hear the voice of Jehovah God walking in the garden in the cool of the day.
And the garden, which was previously a place of comfort and communication, now generates absolute dread.
It's such a powerful auditory image. The sound of the divine moving through their space.
And the immediate implication is the introduction of spiritual distance. Transgression has replaced comfort with terror, intimacy with flight. Instead of running to the divine presence, which was their natural state,
They run from it.
they actively seek to hide themselves amongst the trees of the garden. They're hiding from the source of life and holiness because their moral state can no longer bear proximity to it. They've become incompatible with their own perfect environment.
The narrative just beautifully sets up the inevitable confrontation. You can't hide from the omniscient, but the attempt to hide, that defines the new compromised reality.
So the divine interaction, it shifts instantly from just presence to questioning. And the first words God addresses to the man in verse 9, "Where art thou?"
Such a famous question. And it's so clearly less a geographical query and more a relational assessment.
Well, absolutely. It's not where are you located.
It's where are you, morally and spiritually, in relation to me, to our covenant, to our relationship. It forces Adam to confront his new reality.
And the man's response in verse 10, it gives us the first full articulation of fear that stems from moral awareness. He says, "I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself."
Fear, self-consciousness, evasion. These are now the dominant emotional structures, replacing that simplicity of innocence.
And God's immediate follow-up in verse 11 connects this new fear and shame directly back to the disobedience. "Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldest not eat?"
The divine focus is so precise. The shame is the evidence of the transgression.
And what follows is maybe the most enduring, tragic, and universally relatable moment of the entire chapter.
The blame game.
The complete deflection of responsibility. It establishes this chain of blame that will haunt the human family for the rest of Genesis and, well, beyond.
Adam, the man, immediately shifts the blame in verse 12. And he doesn't just blame the woman, he cleverly implicates the divine.
He does. He says, The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat.
The woman whom thou gavest to be with me.
It's a masterful maneuver of avoiding responsibility. Adam transforms his primary partner, the one he celebrated as bone of my bones in the last chapter, into the root of his downfall.
But by specifying the woman whom thou gavest, he's shifting the origin of the fault one step further back. He's implicitly blaming God for the gift of his helper.
The previously harmonious relationship is just shattered by self-preservation. He turns a gift into a liability. It's cynical.
It's a fundamental breakdown of partnership and accountability.
Yeah.
But isn't the text clear that Adam was there when the command was given? I mean, his responsibility should be absolute, regardless of what the woman did.
That's a crucial point. His responsibility was absolute. He received the command directly. The narrative's emphasis on this deflection highlights the immediate corruption of the will.
So gaining the knowledge of good and evil didn't equip them with the moral courage to confess.
It equipped them with the cunning to evade responsibility. It's the core failure here, the misuse of the very knowledge they sought.
Then the focus shifts to the woman in verse 13. God asks her, "What is this thou hast done?" And she passes the blame further down the chain, but she offers a different kind of justification.
She does. She says, "The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat."
Beguiled me?
Yeah, that term suggests deception and trickery were instrumental. She's acknowledging that she was manipulated by the cunning, subtle intelligence of the creature we met in verse 1. It's less of an outright denial of the act and more of a plea that her will was compromised by an external influence.
So we have this perfect chain of blame. God provided the partner,
The partner gave the fruit.
and the creature deceived the partner. This single moment establishes conflict and shifting accountability, not just between humanity and God, but between the man and the woman, and between the woman and the creature.
And this refusal to own the consequences of their choice, it just fuels all the subsequent narratives of strife and conflict throughout the rest of the source material.
So having established the culpability through this interrogation, the narrative proceeds to the consequences.
This is the structural moment. This is where the world shifts from a garden of ease to a realm of unrelenting struggle.
And the judgments, they aren't arbitrary, are they? They seem to target the participants precisely where they sinned or where they sought mastery.
Exactly. We begin with the judgment on the serpent in verses 14 and 15. The curse is both physical and perpetual.
The serpent is cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field.
And the physical consequence is immediate and visual. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life.
It describes a complete physical degradation, an inversion of its original state. Whatever it looked like before, it's now connected to the lowest, most vulnerable element of the earth.
Right. But the profound significance of the serpent's curse lies in the introduction of this eternal conflict, the establishment of enmity.
This is absolutely critical for understanding everything that comes after, isn't it?
It's everything. This isn't just a disagreement. Enmity means perpetual, relentless antagonism established by God himself between the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring. This relationship will define subsequent conflict.
And this antagonism is wrapped in that very cryptic prediction, verse 15. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel.
Let's unpack that. That injury differential is so important.
Bruising the heel is painful, but it's not fatal.
Right, but bruising the head.
That's potentially fatal.
Exactly. The narrative sets up this struggle where the woman's offspring will suffer pain and injury, but the serpent will ultimately face a decisive, mortal defeat.
So it establishes an ongoing war that the woman's seed will eventually win, despite suffering wounds in the process.
Yes. It's the very first hint of future restoration, and it's contained within the very first formal curse. It immediately defines the trajectory of history outside the garden as a series of battles where humanity, though wounded, retains the promise of ultimate victory over the source of deception.
Okay, so shifting to the woman's judgment in verse 16. We see consequences related to, the fundamental acts of life reproduction, the structure of her relationship with the man.
Her reproductive consequence is laid out very clearly. I will greatly multiply thy pain and thy conception. In pain thou shalt bring forth children.
So the curse has two facets of suffering here.
It does, multiplying the pain associated with delivery and multiplying the conception itself, meaning her life will be intensely focused on the very mechanism, childbearing, that also involves maximum physical anguish.
So life generation, which should have been just a simple part of their existence, now becomes the greatest source of physical agony.
And then, immediately following that, is the relational consequence.
Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Why is this establishment of a hierarchical structure placed right after the curse of painful childbirth?
Well, it cements the breakdown of parity that began with the man's deflection of blame. The original ideal was partnership and unity.
Bone of my bones.
Exactly. The cross formalizes a shift toward conflictual power dynamics. The term desire here is often interpreted as a conflicting, powerful longing. Maybe a longing for the previous equality, or maybe a desire to control him.
But either way,
Either way, the immediate context confirms that this desire is paired with the husband's authority to rule over her. The judgment introduces struggle and hierarchy where unity and mutuality once existed. It means the intimate relationship, the source of comfort, now becomes a source of relational tension and domination.
and finally, we get to the judgment on the man and really the entire physical earth in verses 17 through 19.
And the punishment begins by citing the specific reason for Adam's curse, because he hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee.
His transgression is framed as a failure of primary responsibility. He placed the voice of his spouse above the clear, absolute command of God.
And the consequence of this flawed judgment isn't just personal, it's ecological. Cursed is the ground for thy sake.
That phrase, for thy sake, is profound. It means the curse is delivered as a sort of corrective measure, but it immediately turns the environment itself into an adversary. The lush, effortlessly yielding garden is gone.
The ground becomes adversarial, and the result is the introduction of mandatory, exhausting labor, toil. Food no longer comes easily. He must eat it in toil all the days of thy life.
This is the radical distinction between work before the fall, which was about dominion and cultivation, almost a joyful activity.
And work after the fall, which is relentless, exhausting conflict.
And that conflict is materialized in the specific hardship mentioned in verse 18. The ground will actively fight back, yielding thorns also and thistles.
Thorns and thistles are perfect symbols of an adversarial creation. They're the antithesis of the useful, edible plants of the garden.
Right.
They require effort to remove, they damage the cultivator, and they compete aggressively with useful crops. They just symbolize struggle, resistance, and the fact that basic sustenance now requires constant, injurious conflict with the earth.
And all of this leads inevitably to the ultimate consequence, mortality.
Yeah.
The man is commanded to eat bread in the sweat of thy face till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return.
And this is the explicit fulfillment of the warning from chapter 2.
Oh.
The physical process of decay and death is now formally written into human existence. The labor, the sweat, the toil, all of it is just temporary. It's a holding pattern until the man returns to his molecular origin, dust.
So the curse formalizes labor, relational conflict, pain and reproduction, and physical decay as the four indelible structures of life outside Eden, all stemming directly from that one choice.
And the immortality that was offered by the presence of the tree of life is now implicitly revoked by the very nature of this judgment.
The chapter then concludes with this powerful three-part epilogue that details the transition from the cursed world into the new, conflicted reality.
And the first action after all these pronouncements of judgment is highly symbolic. It's the naming of the woman in verse 20. And the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living.
The context of that naming is just remarkable. Adam has just received his cursed toil and mortality. Eve has just received hers, painful childbirth and subordination, and yet Adam names her Eve, Hawa, meaning life or mother of all living.
It is an assertion of hope in the middle of all this ruin. It accepts the painful, life-defined future, a future involving conception, birth, and death, but it insists that life will continue. It fulfills the promise of the seed that was mentioned just 5 verses earlier.
It's a powerful move away from the immediate shame and toward the promised future, however complicated that future is going to be.
But the immediate reality is still shame. And their pathetic fig leaf aprons, as you said, they weren't cutting it.
Not at all.
So Genesis 3.21 then details God's direct hands-on provision. And Jehovah, God made for Adam and for his wife coats of skins and clothed them.
This is such a crucial theological moment, and it's often understated. Their self-made solution was inadequate. The divine solution is permanent and effective.
But the creation of coats of skins requires the death of an animal. This is the first recorded death in the entire narrative.
So, to cover their shame and nakedness, the immediate result of their moral failure, a creature had to die.
Yes. And this sets a precedent. Divine covering requires a shedding of blood. It represents a dramatic visual transition from their, agricultural self-reliance, the fig leaves, to a dependence on a substitutionary act.
It almost foreshadows the necessity of sacrifice to approach the divine.
I think it does. It communicates that their moral problem required a far greater solution than they could manufacture themselves, a solution that involved the loss of life.
So after this provision of permanent clothing, we get to the theological rationale for the final act of expulsion in verse 22.
And God states, "Behold, the man has become as one of us, to know good and evil."
Which affirms, once again, that the serpent's promise wasn't a total lie. They did achieve a form of knowledge.
They did, but the profound irony is that this self-governance, this knowledge, it came at the expense of moral integrity and relational harmony. The knowledge they gained made them dangerous, not divine.
And the danger is immediately identified. And now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever.
This is the ultimate existential dilemma presented in the narrative.
Immortality, coupled with a corrupted moral will, will be a perpetual catastrophe.
An internal misery. So the expulsion is presented not just as an act of judgment and punishment, but also as an act of profound protective mercy.
Preventing them from locking in their fallen state with eternal life.
It's the ultimate boundary setting.
And Genesis 3:23 narrates the execution of that final sentence. Therefore, Jehovah God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken.
Their return to the harsh, unworked ground of their origins, fulfilling the curse of toil from verse 19. The garden was their gift. The world outside is their demanding taskmaster.
They were formed from the dust, and now they're sent back to struggle with the dust.
And the final security measure in verse 24 is the grand closing of the gates. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim, and the flame of a sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life.
Wow.
The path to eternal, unburdened life is formally and permanently closed off. The cherubim, these celestial fearsome guardians, and that continuously turning flaming sword, they represent an absolute barricade.
So this final act ensures that the human story will now be conducted entirely outside the perfection of Eden, governed by the new harsh rules of toil, pain, and mortality.
But perpetually defined by the promise of the seed.
Genesis chapter 3 really is the foundation upon which the entire subsequent narrative of struggle in the source material is built. Let's just recap the profound nature of this single catastrophic choice.
Well, it all began with that subtle introduction of doubt, which capitalized on the human ambition for self-definition and wisdom.
And the transgression itself, driven by that threefold desire, physical, aesthetic, and intellectual, it immediately fractured their internal state.
Resulting in those acute psychological consequences of shame, fear, and hiding. And this was rapidly followed by the establishment of the 4 permanent structures of the cursed world.
Right. The toil of labor, the pain of reproduction, the conflict of relationships, and the finality of mortality.
And the immediate aftermath in Genesis chapter 4 just shows how instantly that knowledge of good and evil translates into human disaster outside the gates.
The toil and conflict established right here in chapter 3 just instantly spill over into the next generation.
Instantly. Chapter 4 introduces Cain, struggling to till the cursed ground, and Abel, a keeper of sheep. When their offerings lead to divine favor for one and anger for the other, the resentment that was seeded by the conflict and deflection in chapter 3 immediately takes root.
You see the man's labor, the harshness of the ground, and the failure of the human heart leading directly to jealousy and rage.
And when God addresses Cain's anger, the warning is so stark. Sin coucheth at the door. The knowledge of evil, newly acquired in chapter 3, it doesn't lead to higher judgment.
No, it leads directly to the first catastrophic violence, Cain slaying his brother Abel. The descent from moral awareness to homicide happens in the very next narrative step.
The conflict of the cursed ground and the failure of accountability lead directly to murder. The entire subsequent history detailed in Genesis, the moral failure leading to the flood, the Tower of Babel, the dysfunctional conflicts in Abraham's family, it is all fundamentally rooted in this moment of seeking moral self-governance over simple obedience.
The knowledge was acquired, but the resulting actions demonstrated that humanity lacked the integrity to wield that knowledge responsibly.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as you reflect on this material. Adam and Eve gained the knowledge of good and evil. They exchanged a comfortable, ignorant innocence for a painful, self-aware existence defined by sweat, thorns, and death. Was the knowledge truly worth the devastating price of Eden?
And if we acknowledge that every subsequent struggle, every war, every injustice, every sorrow is traced back to this one moment, the narrative really forces us to ask, is the path to recovery found in more knowledge, or less? Since the path of the tree of life is guarded, is the purpose of this long, tortured history outside the garden, ultimately to teach humanity how to live with the pain of self-awareness?
Or is it to establish a path that eventually recovers the moral simplicity that was lost when they walked out of that garden gate for the very last time?